All right, good morning. It is still morning. I forget which time zone I am in, but it doesn't really matter. It's morning somewhere. So good morning, everyone. I'm Vincent Silenzio from the University of Rochester. I want to thank particularly Joe et al. For the invitation to come and speak with you this morning. It's a great pleasure. I am going to speak very, very fast. Part of having partial Italian heritage is that I will talk a lot and I will talk very fast. So please bear with that. If you do have questions, I know we'll have time during the panel, but sometimes I often do not make any sense whatsoever. So do, in a very Italian fashion, feel free to interrupt during the talk to ask me to clarify. That's perfectly okay. In fact, for those of you who have not visited Italian universities, it's actually typical for no one to be paying attention to the speaker directly, but having side conversations continually, et cetera. So it's perfectly fine to interrupt. All right. I wanted to just talk a little bit about an important area in data science that we've been doing progressively more work in over recent years, and just to kind of give a vision piece around what is the work that we do. Now, I am a medical doc and public health researcher. Was a clinical practitioner, am a clinical practitioner, had a primary care practice up until about 9 years ago, became a hospitalist so that I could focus more on my research work, and now I'm becoming even less of a hospitalist and focusing on research almost exclusively at this point. But it's important for me to acknowledge that as a medical doc, my expertise is in medicine. It's not in data science. I'm not a really very quantitative person. I trained actually in medical anthropology. So I'm really much more of a qualitative researcher who somehow has become inserted into a large number crunching operation. All right, does anyone remember the original Star Trek series? Now, when I was in college, we had a drinking game. Anytime Dr. McCoy said, "Damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a whatever," we drank. So I don't remember much of college, but I do want to say that, you know, damn it, Jim, I'm a doctor, not a computer scientist, and we'll take it from there. Who knows anything about the distant early warning system? So the DEW line was actually a series of radar installations that were put up during the Cold War in order to do early detection of a cross-polar nuclear strike. And so the analogy here, this is a straight from the 1950s bit of graphic arts. You can tell just by looking at it that it's from the 1950s. And this is basically just showing what the range of radar installations that have been put in place to detect whether or not an attack may be coming across the pole. Now, for those of you who grew up in the Cold War, you will have a very palpable sense of why it was we worried about such things and why there were radar installations strung all across the frozen Arctic. And for those of you who were not born in time to understand that, just go with the flow here. We needed to basically keep an eye out for missiles coming across the poles. One of the interesting things is this system has evolved over the years. It now no longer just monitors for attacks that might be coming cross-polar, but basically looks for attacks coming from anywhere. If you are an enemy of the US, I would point out that there's a nice gap there. And I will just say that it's not hard to understand when you understand that Trump is our president. All right, so just a little bit of a quick background for you. How did I get here? This is a figure from a study that I did literally about 14 years ago now, where we had demonstrated essentially for the first time the potential for social media for reaching large numbers of previously quote-unquote hidden populations. And so what we had done was, this study was in response to a critique to a grant proposal I put into NIH, which said that there was no way I could find 300 LGBT youth to study, and so there was no point in funding this proposal because there was no way that anyone could find that many LGBT youth. And so we did a quick demonstration that we turned off the software after we hit the first 100,000 and thought this might actually convince the committee, and we did. And so it led to what's called a K-23 Career Development Award from NIH, which is essentially a little bit of a, here's a pile of money, go off and do something good for 5 years. And we did a study looking at self-identified LGBT youth online and looking at the role of connectedness. Connectedness is something we defined basically using the PageRank algorithm, if folks are familiar with PageRank. PageRank is something that anytime you use Google, you're essentially using a descendant of the PageRank algorithm. It made a lot of billionaires along the way. It's the technology really that undergirds most of the modern search engines at their core. And so if you run that in reverse, you actually are able to produce essentially ratings of how well socially connected someone may be within a network graph. And that was the great insight of this project back then. And so the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, was very gracious in supporting the work and getting our lab group set up. We subsequently carried this work off into working with our National Science Foundation in the US, looking at other examples of hidden populations and more work focused on LGBT. Now, for folks who do know XKCD, fantastic, Randall Munroe's cartoons are fantastic. If you don't know them, please look it up, xkcd.com, I believe. And so, you know, the internet is something that's kind of always changing. And this was a map, his first map of the internet, which roughly corresponds to the time that we did our study. And you see MySpace is a very prominent thing. For those of you with an archaeology background, you'll know what MySpace was. I'll leave it at there. And when he updated the map a few years later, clearly MySpace has almost disappeared and Facebook is largely the big player. And so the point of this is that digital spaces are really in transformation very quickly for us. The technologies really are evolving quickly, usage patterns are evolving quickly. The things that we did in 2006 are not feasible to do, were not feasible to do in 2007. So really part of the challenge in carrying out this work for NIMH was the fact that everything we did was already outdated by the time we tried to conduct the study. I ultimately was able to conduct it because well, never mind. We're recording this, so I can't actually tell you why. But anyone who wants to know later, I'll explain how we did that, so I can avoid jail time. So one of the things as an anthropology background, for me, it's very important to kind of understand the technologies themselves and how people are using them. So really why it's so important to do the kind of co-design research is that it's really how Vince Silenzio uses Facebook is very different than how Vince Silenzio used Facebook yesterday. And how I'm using Twitter today is different than how I will use it in 6 months. So things really kind of change, and you have to understand that situated change. But the other piece that I thought was really useful and insightful from this particular cartoon is the more we invent new things, they do have some analogs in the past. And so they really are helpful for us sometimes to think about something in terms of, well, what is this akin to other types of activities so that we can understand the types of information that may be present in that particular medium. And why is that important? Higgs boson. Who here is a Higgs boson fan? Huh? Aside from myself. So the Higgs is actually the last fundamental particle, physical particle that has been discovered. They announced this at CERN a few years ago. This is the announcement as all the physicists were getting extremely excited looking for a 5 sigma result. I did actually stay up to watch this live stream coming from Geneva, so I have to confess I am a little bit of a nerd. But the Higgs boson is the piece that actually provides mass for all other particles. So it's really an incredibly important fundamental particle. Dr. Higgs predicted it back in the 1960s. The technology was nowhere near able to be developed in any time, and he thought this would be confirmed probably 2 or 3 lifetimes after he was gone. And Peter Higgs is actually sitting in the back audience in there during the announcement. So the particle accelerator at CERN is actually powerful enough to be able to have defined the existence of this particle. Now, why are we talking about particle physics? I live in Rochester, New York, which is a place that receives an awful lot of snow, so you will forgive the snow analogy. But the New York Times did a fantastic animated illustration to demonstrate how the Higgs may actually provide mass to other particles. And I've just stolen it for the use of how to think about what data we find in these data sources. And so you can think of a field of snow, and there are basically 3 ways to cross this field of snow. You can cross it on a pair of skis. And so if you are on a pair of skis, and this Rembrandt production was mine, so clearly don't ask me to draw your pictures. If you cross on skis, you will leave a trail in the snow, but a pretty fine one. It's there, it can be seen, but it's pretty fine. If you wear snowshoes, you will leave a deeper path, much more obvious path through the snow, and a little bit easier to detect. You don't have to squint really hard to see it. If you happen to walk through barefoot in the snow, you will leave a trough that can be seen more clearly from space than the Great Wall of China. And so, depending on how thoroughly or how much that particular medium interacts with the type of data that you are looking for, you have a signal that is either very easily detectable or not so detectable. And so this is really a very useful idea when thinking about any source of online data, any source of big data in terms of the type of phenomena that we can study, types of phenomena that we can study within that source of data. I just want to point out one 4th way of interacting with this, and that's if you happen to be a bird flying over this field, you don't interact with it at all. So unless you leave some droppings along the way, which is a possibility, the chances are that there isn't much we're going to learn about this bird by studying the snow, the data left in the snow. And so why do we talk about this stuff? Well, just like we study supernovae in astronomy, we know that this star right here is probably the one that blew up a few years ago because it's left this palimpsest, if you will, around it. And so we don't get to see the supernova, but we do get to see the residual effects of the supernova. And so many times the data itself is also analogous to this. We don't get to see the original thing that happened, but we'll get to see the after effects of what's happened. So these ideas are actually really key to trying to understand how you make data do incredible things it was never intended to do. Very few people post online so that you can figure out whether or not they are having distress, but you can figure out whether or not they're having distress very, very easily. That's one example. We can also figure out lots of things about people's demographic variables very easily from the data and from fairly minimal amounts of data. This is just an actual plot of the dew line. It's a nice transition slide. And as you can see, these were not vacation places for the people stationed at these stations. So here's an example. You can't read it, but basically, if anyone has ever been to Las Vegas or ever goes to Las Vegas, you may thank the fact that I once got food poisoning on my way back from an NIH review panel, and while I was vomiting into the commode, texted my graduate student at the time, who's now at Google Research, and just said, you know, Adam, I think we can maybe study food poisoning in Twitter data, Rach, and why don't we talk about this on Monday, Rach? Monday morning, Adam, who is an amazing, amazing guy, came in basically with the analysis done and said, look, here, we can study food poisoning in Twitter data. And this led to a series of subsequent work and some presentations where folks from Las Vegas came up to us and said, we want to buy your system. And we said, we don't sell the system because we're academicians. We don't sell things. We don't commercialize. And so we worked together with the health department in Las Vegas to develop a system that essentially was used funded by CDC for a time to do the restaurant inspections. Now, why would anybody tweet on Twitter about food poisoning? They don't, right? So it's very rare for somebody to say something like, I just ate at restaurant X, we'll say maybe a Trump property, and then I got sick. And so, not that people get sick eating at Trump properties, you have to be sick to eat it. And so you know, they don't. And so really what happens is you find more like the supernova. They don't describe getting food poisoning. They don't know they do. It's 24 to 72 hours later where they're saying my belly hurts or I haven't felt like this in a long time, et cetera. It's actually the fact that we can plot, we can predict everyone's geolocation in space over time, look for people reporting symptoms that are symptom-like, and look for where their geospatial lines overlap. And if that happens to match up with a restaurant, then bingo, we have an idea of where people may be getting ill. And so you would think, well, that's really incredibly thin data. You're making predictions about location where you don't even have the location data. You're making predictions about symptoms when you don't even have the symptoms. And miraculously, it works. The thing to remember about data science is, at scale, almost anything works. And so no matter how thin the data, no matter how sparse the data, the systems actually will work. Now, I just want to point out that, you know, Twitter is useful for a great deal of things. As we know, some people will tweet random ramblings from all sorts of times of day. And in case you need it confirmed, no, these are not real. But it would be cool if they were. Anyway, all right, just one more time. I want to remind you that really I am a doctor. I'm not a mathematician, but let me show you where we carried this work. This was the result of scribbling while in a car on my way somewhere as a passenger, where we were thinking about this problem of, well, what if we wanted to try to predict sexual orientation, gender identity from this sparse Twitter data, where it's not something that is generally reported directly by folks, but could we do this to discover it? And this is what happens when you let a physician start scribbling down notes about mathematical things. They're pretty much useless. But this is why you collaborate with people who are smart, so that they could take those scribblings and actually turn them into something useful or worthwhile. Now, I'm going to talk to you about the ethical problems that come from this, so I'll tell you now that I'm showing you an earlier version of this stuff that doesn't work all that well. And the reason I want to show you an earlier version that doesn't work all that well is because we don't want it to work all that well until we figure out how to do things like protect people from abusing populations that this would help them to discover. So folks may be familiar with the recent purges, essentially, that have gone on in Chechnya. I was originally going to say this was something that happened in the past, but then again, just reoccurred a couple of weeks ago. And so, you know, if you have a bad actor who can take technologies that help them locate people that they want to be discriminating against, that is definitely not a good problem to have. And so one of the problems of our work, our intent is to expand the work so that we essentially can help create, I told you I'm a public health person, I want to create essentially a self-driving mental health process for folks who may be LGBTQ or related sexual and gender minorities. And so we'd like to do this at scale, and we'd like to do this without necessarily anybody knowing their status. But the pieces that we build in order to do that actually do have this collateral damage potential of getting out in the wild and being abused by malign actors. And so one of our group's really main focuses in recent years has been to try to develop a framework, ethical framework, for trying to guide the development and usage as well as publications of methods in these areas, given the essentially current risks to other people. Oh, this is another XKCD cartoon. So if you don't follow him, please do. It's awesome stuff. All right. And so really, one of the things that I think are absolutely critical is the involvement of stakeholders at all stages of the development. So if it weren't for the Chechnya piece being in the news, we might not necessarily have thought about worrying about this. And so if we were doing this absent of our stakeholders and without that kind of headlining work, we may have put something into the wild that would be abused and could be abused right away. And so we really think that the key to sort of managing the unintended consequences of the work is to try to involve stakeholders at really all stages along the way. And really to acknowledge the threats to privacy to the targeted populations. No one who is being discovered by our algorithms through their Twitter data or their Facebook data or their actually Google search data is another place in which we've demonstrated this. No one is actually searching there thinking, okay, well, that Silienzio guy is going to know my orientation and is going to build a self-driving health system around it. I didn't give permission for that, you know. So thinking through the notions of how to be clear with the populations that would be served by these types of interventions is actually a key area for us. And we don't have the answers for this. I just want to say that we're at least thinking about it, but I don't want to claim that we have sorted out exactly what to do with regard to that. But the guiding principle behind all of this is really this concept of the Aeneid. If anyone has read Virgil, then forgive the misspelling. But basically, everything knowable about everybody is discoverable. It's basically the data traces that we have been leaving in our online behavior, in our mobile devices, et cetera, really provide the basis for us to discover, literally predicting maybe underwear color that we're all wearing at this moment in time. All right, now that might not be a very useful innovation, but I can guarantee you that I can find somebody in computer science who would think that was a really cool project to work on, and they will do it. And so really the idea that any aspect of reality is ultimately discoverable, and thinking about backwards from that issue, where do we put in the frameworks for being able to regulate how that is done and to what uses that's considered appropriate, and how to address when those uses have become abuses and to effectively to mitigate those. And so one of the things that we have been working on, I should say, is thinking about countermeasures. If I can tell you who every gay man in Chechnya is, great, but if I don't want the Chechen government to be doing that, how do I actually disrupt that data sufficiently so that it won't work, so that they're, in essence, not able to get that as a response? And so that is more of an active area for us at the moment than the prospect of publishing on this, because we'd rather publish how to break it rather than how to use it. And then I just also wanted to talk briefly about some of the work that we've done looking at search data. So far, this work is focused largely around depression, anxiety symptom detection. Suicidality is ultimately the next go-round for us. But we've also done work on intimate partner violence in this sphere. So I forgot to give a shout out to our lightning round presenters. That was awesome stuff, folks. And I was scribbling down notes on all the people I have to put you in touch with that I know or work with. And intimate partner violence is an area in which it turns out some really cool stuff emerges, even just from temporal patterns in terms of the times that people are doing searches. And I didn't bring the graphic, but we, for instance, found that on the weekends, people not exposed to intimate partner violence seem to stop doing searches, and people exposed to intimate partner violence start doing more searches. And we've decided that this must mean that the partner is coming home from work, so let's spend time on the computer instead of interacting with them. And then one other piece that we're looking at, have folks used voice assistant in Google or other Alexa, other voice assistants? Yeah. So you know what painful process that can be sometimes, because Siri can be pretty dunderheaded. And so one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of the deployment of these, of gathering these types of data, essentially compiling a profile that lives on an individual's device that interacts with their own voice assistant piece to help refine how it works. So this is a process, or a model of machine learning now called federated learning or distributed learning, depending on the groups. And essentially, this is a way to make sure that the private data that exists, say, in your phone, stays in your phone, that the analysis of that data can be conducted on the phone, and that inside the operating system, it can interact with health apps to provide the kinds of guidance that the health app needs to give a better answer. So as an example of the dunderheadedness, I believe this is just an example of if you currently pull out the Google Voice Assistant and try to search for something or try to express some distress, you will often get some entertaining kinds of answers in response. And so one of the ideas is that if the device is actually already somewhat aware that you may be having some distress, the answers that you get will not necessarily try to make you see your photos, but might actually connect you to a chat line, might actually connect you to services.
Google Photos.
And so you might not want to look at the Google Photos, but actually I forgot, those are my summer research fellows from last year. I believe research needs to be conducted in beer halls. Thank you very much. So I just want to get that out there. Yes. And so, one of the issues is that currently the systems are not smart enough to necessarily respond in a helpful way, and that these systems really can be incredibly powerful in terms of the types of both soft and hard redirection that it can give to a user. And so that, for us, is, I think, ultimately a model in which if we have an app on our device that is going to help us run through some CBT, then having your OS pull that app up for you or encourage you to get to that app at the moment you need it or the moment that you might optimally want to interact with it, then we've made an important improvement to the underlying operating system. And so this is part of the work I'm doing this year. I'm on sabbatical this year, and part of the work is focused on looking at this as a potential model, the federated learning pieces as a potential model for priming the resources that might already be on somebody's device. And with that, I just want to say that it's important to remember data is everywhere. It's important to think about your own pieces, your own work in this area, by remembering that data is everywhere, and not necessarily waiting for the folks who are sitting in Silicon Valley or other versions of Silicon Valley around the world. Don't wait for them to think up the idea. If you've seen this and you've thought about it, this is the kind of piece where you come back and you say to them, I think you might find this in your data, and that's where they get the idea to do the work. So it's really important to bear that in mind. The data itself is sometimes socially structured and sometimes it's not. When it is, we analyze it one way. When it's not, we analyze it often the same way, but sometimes differently. So depending on the underlying structuring of the data and the phenomenon that you're interested in, it makes a difference in how you set this up. And really, basically, new tools for dealing with these massive amounts of data, new approaches like federated learning are in the pipeline. I'm saying federated learning, that's already like so last month, right? And so really it's important to bear in mind that not only are the media platforms changing, but also the methods that we have available for analyzing them and working with them are very rapidly progressing. And that these basically leave us in the dust in terms of what our ethical guidelines are for what to do. But there are interested people working on this all across the globe, particularly in the ethical area. And so if you ever find yourself with a question about it and you're not quite sure who to turn to, I don't do work in this area, but I can guarantee you that I probably have a suggestion for somebody who does. So by all means, reach out, because I would be glad to put you in touch with folks. Remember, early detection, early warning is the way to keep a Cold War from becoming hot. And see, don't these look like wonderful vacation spots? I guess if you cross-country ski, because that's about it, right? And remember that if you are looking for an attack route, no suggestions. I just want to acknowledge the very long list of people that put up with having to work with an idiotic medical doc who doesn't know how to turn on the devices half the time, but really are incredibly patient and really very generative folks to work with. I probably should also acknowledge my partner of 33 years who did the original MySpace crawling algorithm and ran it on his old MacBook 100, I think it was. Actually, it was probably a MacBook minus 100 at that time. And so we got all that data, all that data to a geneticist who I conned into doing that for me. And with that, I just want to thank you for letting me have a fun time.